I'll never forget the way the Houston summer heat felt that graduation morning at the police academy, like standing inside an oven even though the sun had barely risen. The humidity was so thick you could taste it, mixing with the scent of freshly cut grass and the sharp smell of shoe polish we'd all frantically applied to our boots the night before. My hands were shaking as I stood in formation with my fellow cadets, 47 of us in total, and I was one of only 6 women. The weight of that reality pressed down on me almost as heavily as the Texas sun would in a few hours. "Officer America Santos," Chief Reynolds called out, his voice booming across the parade ground with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years commanding respect. I stepped forward, my boots clicking against the pavement in what I hoped was perfect rhythm, my heart hammering so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. The badge felt impossibly heavy in my palm when he handed it to me, cool metal that somehow burned against my skin. This was everything. This was validation for 3 years of night classes while working double shifts at the diner on Westheimer Road, where the smell of grease and coffee had become so embedded in my clothes I could barely remember what clean laundry smelled like. This was proof that the countless hours at the gym, building muscles on a frame that had always been small and slight, had meant something. This was my answer to every rejection letter, every "we'll keep your application on file," every barely concealed look of skepticism when I'd tell people I wanted to be a cop. My mother was in the audience, sitting in the 3rd row with my father, and even from where I stood, I could see her shoulders shaking as she cried into a tissue. She'd worn her best dress, the navy blue one she usually saved for church, and her hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn every day for as long as I could remember. My father sat beside her, his construction-worn hands folded in his lap, his face composed, but his eyes bright with an emotion he'd never voice. He gave me one single nod, and that nod meant more than any speech, any congratulations, any praise ever could. It meant he saw me. It meant he was proud. It meant that all those years of watching him struggle to provide for us, watching him come home exhausted and discouraged, but never defeated, had taught me something essential about perseverance. But the seat next to them, the one I'd specifically reserved, the one I'd marked with a small card that read, "Reserved for Marcus Santos," sat empty. That empty chair was like a black hole in my peripheral vision, pulling my attention even as I tried to focus on the ceremony, on the accomplishment, on this moment I'd worked so hard to achieve. Marcus had been my hero for as long as I could remember. He was 6 years older than me, and growing up in our small house in the East End of Houston, he'd seemed like something out of a movie. While I was small and bookish, always with my nose in a novel or studying for some test, Marcus was athletic and confident, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately became its center. Our house had been tiny, just 3 bedrooms with walls so thin you could hear everything, but Marcus had filled it with his presence. I'd spent my childhood following him around like a shadow, watching him play baseball in the empty lot down the street, listening to him talk about his dreams of serving his country, absorbing every word like gospel. When Marcus enlisted in the Marines at 18, I was 12 years old. I remember standing on our cracked concrete porch, the morning sun already scorching even though it was barely 7 a.m., watching him climb into my uncle's truck with his duffel bag. He'd looked back at me and saluted, a real military salute even though he hadn't earned the right to use it yet. And I'd saluted back, tears streaming down my face. He'd called me Little Soldier and promised to write every week. For the first few months he did write. Letters that arrived in thin envelopes covered with official military stamps, telling sanitized versions of boot camp adventures. Then he was deployed, and the letters became less frequent, briefer, stripped of anything real. Marcus served 2 tours in Iraq, and the brother who came back wasn't quite the same as the one who'd left. He was quieter, more intense, prone to long silences where he'd stare at nothing in particular. But he came back decorated with a Purple Heart from an IED attack that had killed 2 of his unit members and left him with shrapnel scars across his left side. Our neighborhood treated him like royalty. At every family gathering, every cookout where the smell of barbecue would drift over fences and draw neighbors like a magnet, people would cluster around Marcus. They'd ask him to tell his stories, to describe the desert, the combat, the feeling of serving. And Marcus would oblige, his voice steady and measured, describing things in enough detail to satisfy curiosity, but never revealing anything that seemed truly real, truly painful. I'd sit on the periphery during those gatherings, usually on the back steps with a plate of my aunt's potato salad balanced on my knees, watching my brother perform. Because that's what it felt like. A performance. The real Marcus. The one who'd wake up at 3 a.m. with nightmares he'd never discuss. The one who'd flinch at sudden loud noises. The one who sometimes got a look in his eyes like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. That Marcus never appeared at family gatherings. And I found myself wondering if the brother I'd idolized had ever really existed, or if I'd just projected my own fantasies onto a person who was much more complicated than my childhood imagination had allowed for. I'd told myself for years that I wanted to follow in Marcus's footsteps, that I wanted to serve and protect like he had. But sitting there after graduation, staring at that empty chair, I had to acknowledge a truth I'd been avoiding. I hadn't chosen this career because of Marcus. I'd chosen it despite him, or maybe to prove something to him. The motivations were tangled and complicated, rooted in years of being the little sister, the afterthought, the one who was never quite enough. Growing up in the East End, I'd seen things that had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I'd watched my mother work herself to exhaustion cleaning houses for wealthy families in River Oaks. Those massive estates with manicured lawns and pools bigger than our entire house. She'd leave before dawn and come back after dark, her hands cracked and raw from chemicals, her back aching, her face worn with the kind of fatigue that sleep couldn't cure. My father's construction work was inconsistent, dependent on the economy and the weather and the whims of contractors who often treated their workers as disposable. There were months when we'd had plenty, when the refrigerator was full, and my parents' conversations at night were about normal things. And there were months when dinner was rice and beans, when I'd hear my mother crying quietly in the kitchen while she counted bills, when the electricity would get shut off and we'd eat by candlelight and pretend it was an adventure. I'd seen neighbors struggle with addiction, the kind that starts with a prescription for a work injury and ends with someone losing everything. I'd watched domestic disputes through thin walls and open windows, heard the sound of violence that no one would report because calling the police felt more dangerous than the violence itself. I'd witnessed good people make terrible choices because they felt trapped, because the systems that were supposed to help them felt more like obstacles than support. And I'd wanted to be different. I'd wanted to be someone who could help, who could make a real difference in communities like the one I grew up in. The military had never appealed to me. I didn't want to leave Houston, didn't want to fight in wars I barely understood in countries I'd never seen. But police work, that felt like something tangible, something immediate. It felt like a way to serve the people I knew, in the places I understood. But when I'd first mentioned this dream to Marcus, sitting on his apartment balcony in Midtown, I'd faced a wall of opposition that had shocked me. We'd been drinking Shinerbach, watching the traffic crawl along Main Street 12 stories below, the downtown skyline lit up against the darkening sky. I'd worked up my courage, rehearsed what I wanted to say, and finally told him I was applying to the police academy. The look on his face had stopped me cold. It wasn't concern or even skepticism. It was something closer to disgust, like I'd told him I was planning to do something fundamentally stupid and offensive. Police academy? He'd said, setting down his beer with enough force that foam spilled over the top. America, tell me you're joking. I'm completely serious, I'd replied, forcing my voice to stay steady even though my heart was racing. I've already started the application. I've been studying for the entrance exam and I've been training. Training? He'd interrupted, standing up and pacing the narrow balcony like a caged animal. Little sister, you're barely 5'4". You weigh what, 120 if you're soaking wet? You think you can handle street thugs, gangbangers, guys who are 6'2", 250, hopped up on PCP or meth? Being a good cop isn't just about physical strength, I'd argued, hating how defensive I sounded, but unable to stop myself. It's about intelligence, about reading situations, about de-escalation and communication, and about not getting killed in your first month on the job. He'd interrupted again, his voice rising. That's what it's about. Staying alive. And you know what? Women shouldn't be cops. I'm sorry, but it's true. You don't have the physical strength, You don't have the aggression, and when shit hits the fan, and it will hit the fan, you're going to hesitate. You're going to get emotional. And that hesitation is going to get you killed. Or worse, it's going to get your partner killed. His words had hit me like physical blows. That's sexist bullshit, I'd said, my voice shaking with anger. There are plenty of women in law enforcement who are excellent cops. Plenty? He'd laughed, a harsh sound that made me flinch. Name 5. Name 5 women cops who are actually on patrol, actually dealing with dangerous situations, who are as good as their male counterparts. I'll wait. I'd opened my mouth to respond and found I couldn't. Not because female officers didn't exist. They did. But because I'd been caught off guard by the venom in his voice, by the absolute certainty that I was wrong. We'd argued for another hour, our voices getting louder, our words getting meaner, until finally I'd grabbed my purse and left his apartment. My eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall until I was in my car. That had been 2 years ago, and we'd barely spoken since. There had been awkward encounters at family gatherings, stilted conversations that stayed surface level, a distance between us that felt like a canyon. My mother would try to mediate, to smooth things over, insisting that Marcus loved me and just worried about my safety. But I knew better. This wasn't about love or concern. This was about Marcus believing, fundamentally and completely, that I was making a mistake, that I was too weak, too female, too something to do the job I'd chosen. And now, on what should have been one of the proudest days of my life, he couldn't even be bothered to show up. The reception after graduation was held in the academy cafeteria, with sheet cake and cheap coffee and the kind of forced socializing that happens when families and colleagues mix. My mother immediately pulled me aside, her hands cupping my face the way she'd done since I was a child, her eyes still wet with tears. "Mija, I'm so proud of you," she said in Spanish, her accent thick with emotion. "You've always been stubborn, just like your abuela. When you decide something, nothing can stop you, not even your brother." "Is he coming to dinner tonight?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Her expression shifted, guilt and sadness crossing her features. "He said he has to work late. But you know Marcus loves you, America. He worries. The world is dangerous, especially for women, and he's seen things that he thinks I'm going to fail," I said flatly, pulling away from her touch. "He thinks I'm too weak, too emotional, too female to do this job. That's not worry, Mama. That's contempt. America, don't say that. He's your brother. He hasn't spoken to me in 2 years except to tell me I'm making a mistake," I interrupted, my voice harder than I'd intended. "He didn't come to graduation. He doesn't support this. And honestly, I don't need his approval. I'm going to be a great cop whether he believes in me or not." My mother looked like she wanted to say more, but my father appeared at her elbow, his presence immediately calming the tension. He looked at me with those steady brown eyes, the ones that had seen decades of struggle and disappointment, but had never lost their fundamental kindness, and said simply, "Your brother is wrong. You will be a good officer. You have the heart for it." Coming from my father, a man of few words, this was a speech. I felt tears prick my eyes and blinked them back, nodding my thanks. But as I drove home that evening, still in my dress uniform, the city lights of Houston blurring past my windows, I couldn't shake the weight of Marcus's absence, the way it had hollowed out what should have been a perfect day. My first assignment was to the Southwest Patrol Division, covering some of the toughest neighborhoods in Houston. The division headquarters was a squat, utilitarian building on Bel Air Boulevard, surrounded by a parking lot that shimmered with heat even in the early morning. My training officer was Sergeant Mike Chen, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for being tough but fair. He was waiting for me on my first day, leaning against his patrol car with a cup of coffee in one hand, his expression neutral as he looked me over. "Santos," he said by way of greeting, not offering his hand. "You're 5 minutes early. Good. I hate waiting. Let's go." We pulled out of the parking lot at exactly 6 a.m., the city still mostly asleep, the streets empty except for delivery trucks and the occasional homeless person pushing a shopping cart filled with their entire life. The patrol car smelled like stale coffee and the particular combination of sweat and cleaning products that seemed universal to police vehicles. The computer screen between us glowed with the day's assignments, and Chen navigated through it without looking, his fingers moving with practiced ease. "You know why I requested you as my rookie?" he asked, his eyes on the road, his tone conversational, but with an edge to it. "No, sir," I replied, my hands folded in my lap, every muscle tense with the effort of projecting confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Because I read your academy scores. Tactical scenarios, 97%. Firearms qualification, expert marksman. Criminal law and procedures, top of your class. Physical fitness, 91st percentile." He glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable. "You're smart, you've got good instincts, and you work hard. But you know what else I noticed when I read your file?" "No, sir. You're going to have to work twice as hard as everyone else to get half the respect," he said bluntly. "That's just reality. I'm not saying it's right. It's not right. But it's true. Some of the officers in this division are going to assume you got this job because of affirmative action or diversity quotas. Some of them are going to assume you're too weak, too emotional, too whatever to do real police work. Some of them are going to test you, push you, try to make you quit. So the question is, are you ready for that?" "Yes, sir," I said without hesitation, even though fear was coiling in my stomach like a snake. "We'll see," he replied, but there was something in his tone that might have been approval. "First rule, I don't care about your gender, your background, or anything else. I care about whether you can do the job. You watch my back, I'll watch yours. You screw up, I'll tell you. You do good work, I'll tell you that too. Fair enough?" "Fair enough," I agreed. That first week was a baptism by fire. We responded to domestic disturbances where people screamed at each other in languages I didn't understand, where children cowered in corners and the air reeked of alcohol and desperation. We made traffic stops that could have gone sideways in a heartbeat, approaching vehicles not knowing if the driver was just someone running late to work or someone with a warrant and a gun. We took reports from victims of theft, assault, fraud, people whose faith in the system was already hanging by a thread, who looked at us with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Chen taught me to read body language, to watch hands, to listen not just to what people said, but how they said it. He taught me when to be firm and when to show compassion, when to enforce the letter of the law and when to exercise discretion. He taught me the rhythm of the streets, the way neighborhoods had their own personalities, their own rules, their own unspoken dynamics. But I also learned about the culture within the department itself, and it was even more hostile than I'd expected. In the women's locker room, a small, dingy space that always smelled like old socks and industrial cleaner, conversations would stop abruptly when I entered. During briefings, I'd hear comments just loud enough for me to catch about diversity hires and lowered standards, and whether the department was really so desperate for recruits they're taking anyone now. At the shooting range, the instructor would watch every shot I took with undisguised skepticism, only grudgingly admitting I'd outscored most of my academy class when I put 9 out of 10 shots in the center mass at 25 yards. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into my probation, I was in the break room making coffee when 2 officers I didn't know well came in. They were older, probably in their 40s, with the kind of swagger that comes from years of never being challenged. They didn't acknowledge me, just started talking as if I wasn't there. "Did you see Rodriguez got stuck with the new girl?" one of them said, grabbing a donut from the box on the counter. "Yeah, I heard." Chen finished his probation babysitting duty and passed her along. Poor Rodriguez. He's probably counting the days until she washes out or gets transferred to some desk job where she can't do any damage. "I give her 6 months," the other one said. "Maybe less. First time she has to physically restrain someone, first time she has to chase a suspect on foot, first time things get really hairy, she'll fold. They always do." I'd kept my back to them, stirring sugar into my coffee with a hand that wanted to shake but that I forced to stay steady. Everything in me wanted to turn around, to confront them, to defend myself. But Chen's words echoed in my head, "Let your work speak for itself." So I'd walked out of that break room with my head high, even as anger and humiliation burned in my chest. "Don't let them get to you," Chen advised that afternoon when I told him what had happened. We were parked outside a gas station on Hillcroft, watching the flow of traffic, the sun beating down mercilessly. Half of them are dinosaurs who can't adapt to a changing world. The other half are insecure about their own abilities and feel threatened. You keep doing good work, and eventually even they'll have to acknowledge it. And if they don't? I asked. Then fuck 'em, Chen said simply. You're not here to make friends. You're here to be a good cop. Focus on that. 3 months into my probation, everything changed. It was a Thursday night, the kind of sticky Houston evening where the temperature stayed in the 90s even after sunset, and the air felt like breathing through a wet towel. Chen and I were responding to a call about a disturbance at an apartment complex in Gulfton, one of the most densely populated and challenging neighborhoods in our division. The complex was a maze of identical buildings, balconies stacked on top of each other, cars crammed into every available space. Spanish music blared from open windows, mixing with children's voices and the constant background hum of window AC units struggling against the heat. The call had been vague. Neighbors reporting yelling and what sounded like furniture being thrown. Domestic disturbances were always unpredictable, always potentially dangerous. Chen briefed me as we approached, his voice calm but his body language alert. Let me take the lead on initial contact, he said. You watch the periphery. Watch for weapons. Watch for other people who might get involved. Keep your hand near your weapon, but don't draw unless I do or unless there's immediate danger. And Santos? Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. We climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, the metal steps clanging under our boots, and followed the sound of raised voices to apartment 304. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see movement, hear a man's voice yelling in slurred English. Chen knocked firmly, announcing, Houston Police Department. We received a call about a disturbance. The door swung open and a man appeared, maybe mid-30s, heavily intoxicated, his face flushed and angry. Behind him I could see a woman with a split lip and tear-streaked face, clutching a young child who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. We don't need no police, the man said, swaying slightly. This is my house, my family, none of your business. Sir, we received a call about a disturbance, and we need to make sure everyone's safe, Chen said calmly, his body positioned to block the doorway. Can we come in and talk for a minute? I said we don't need no police, the man shouted, and suddenly there was a knife in his hand, a large kitchen knife that caught the light from the hallway. Get out! This is my home! Everything happened very fast and very slow at the same time. Chen's hand went to his weapon but didn't draw it. I stepped slightly to the side, angling my body to have a clear view of both the man and the woman behind him. My heart was hammering, but my hands were steady, my mind suddenly crystal clear. Sir, I need you to put down the knife, Chen said, his voice still calm but with steel underneath. Nobody needs to get hurt here. Just put down the knife and let's talk. The man lunged,